In this lecture, we're going to be enhancing our class book using fields from Pydantic. Now, a field is a way for us to add extra validation to each variable within book. For example, a small flaw in our application is if I open up our browser and we want to create a new book and click try it out, we can make the title completely empty. For example, I can make the author Coding with Roby. I can make the description an awesome book. However, title can still be submitted when it's literally not equal to any type of string. It's just an empty string. If we say execute, we can see that we get a successful 200 response with an empty title. If we come up to read all books and we try it out and execute, we're going to get our book back, but our title is going to be empty. So we want to add extra validation to these books that are getting submitted over the request body before we start manipulating any type of data. We can do this by importing field also from Pydantic. So right after base model, I'm going to say comma field. And now within title, I'm going to say equals field. And now inside field, there's a whole bunch of different objects we can call inside. There's alias, there's a title, there's description, const, we have greater than, less than, we have max characters or max length and minimal length. We have a whole bunch of different attributes we can add to create extra data validation attached to each one of these variables. For example, within field, I'm going to type in min_length. And I'm going to say min length is 1 character. So now moving forward, if we create a new book, the title has to be at least 1 character long. So if we save this application and we open up our browser and we refresh the page, and we're going to try it out for read all books, and it's going to be empty now because when we saved our file, our server reloaded. But if we scroll down to post now, we can see that everything's required. It doesn't look like anything has changed here. However, if we say try it out, and I make an empty string, and I'm just going to leave author as string and description as string, and I click execute, we get an error unprocessable entity. The message says ensure this value has at least 1 character, and that value error.anyString.minLength, and that limit value is equal to 1. And our location is our title, so our title needs at least 1 character to be successfully processed. Now, what is so awesome about FastAPI is FastAPI and Pydantic are doing all of this data validation without any extra coding effort from you. This is all embedded within everything that we're going to be using, that FastAPI and Pydantic are going to be allowing us to do data validation and data parsing without us having to do any work. So if we want to fix this error, we can come up here and just type in any character within this string and now execute. And now we can see that it successfully responds with the 200 status code and that title is now equal to A. If we scroll to the top and we now say read all books and execute, we now once again have a new book within our books list with a title of A. Now let's go ahead and add a field to our description. Now our description is going to have a field of a title, which is going to describe the book with a max length of 100 characters and a minimal length of 1 character. So I'm going to say field parentheses, and then I'm going to say title equals description of book, comma max length equals 100, and I'm going to say comma min length equals 1. And now if we save and go back to our application or back to our Swagger browser and we refresh the application, if we come back down to create book, our description now has extra validation attached to it. If we say try it out and we leave description to be empty and we say execute, we are now going to get an unprocessable entity from description. If this was 100 characters long, we would also get an error, which is going to say ensure this value has under 100 characters because our max length within the field is 100 and our minimal length is only 1. But you may be asking yourself, how would you know these data validations even exist if you're working in the Swagger documentation? Well, remember, Swagger is a dynamic documentation for your APIs. It keeps track of all of this and it's completely fluent with Pydantic and FastAPI. So if we go back to our browser and we scroll up to close this post request, and we scroll down to schemas, we can see the validation errors, HTTP validation errors, and book. If we open up book, we can see that ID is of type UUID, title is a string with a minimal length of 1, author is a string, description is a description of the book right there, and if we remember that, that's because of the description of the book title we add right here in the field, with a max length of 100 and a min length of 1, and a rating, which is an integer title of rating. Our HTTP validation error will just give us information on what our error details will look like if a HTTP validation error occurs. And same thing with validation error. It'll give us a schema of what our validation error will look like. And now lastly, let's do one more enhancement. Within our description, let's say we don't always need to have a description and we just want it to be optional. If a user or a client wants to add a description to a book, they can, but if they don't want to, that is totally okay as well. We can do this the same way we are adding optionals within the query parameters. We do that by typing in optional and then wrapping string in brackets. However, we're going to have to import optional, import this name from typing.optional. And now we have our optional description, which works perfectly with our application. So if we resave our application and we jump back over to our browser and we refresh, and we want to create a new book, we can now say try it out and completely eliminate the description variable inside book. We can now say execute this command and we'll get the response body of a status code 200 with the description of just being null, but it doesn't need to be fulfilled for any kind of requirement during the parsing of the application. If we scroll all the way back down to the schemas of book, we can now see description has the exact same items. It's no longer required within the book object that we're sending to the server. FastAPI works with Swagger and Pydantic to literally remove time from your development, but to still successfully be able to create rapid applications or fast applications. This wraps up how to use Field to create your books and base models to be more dynamic for data validation. And I will see you in the next video. In this lecture, we're going to enhance our rating and our author within our book base model class. We're going to enhance it by using fields. We're going to be setting greater than and less than for the rating to keep individuals between 1 and 100 or 0 and 100. And we'll be adding a max length to authors and a minimal length to author as well. So let's start by adding this to our rating. Rating:int is equal to field. And inside field, we have a greater than, we can say by doing GT, which stands for greater than. We're going to say greater than -1. Now remember, this is greater than, not greater than or equal to. It needs to be greater than. So 0 is greater than -1, but -1 is not greater than -1. So if we want to make sure the ratings are between 0 and 100, we need to make sure that it's greater than -1. And then we can also say less than, which we need to say is less than 101. Because again, 100 is less than 101, but 101 and higher numbers are not less than 101. So right here with rating int equals field greater than equals -1 and less than equals 101, this means that a client's rating needs to be between 0 and 100. And for author, we also want to do another field for extra data validation. Here we can just say equals field, and inside here we want to say that the author's minimal length is equal to 1. We're also going to say the maximal length of an author is less than 100. Typically, you're going to be adding these kind of data validations to objects because of how the SQL database or whatever type of database you are using, it depends on how many characters they are allowing for certain areas or certain columns within a table. And it's oftentimes that the author variable is not allowed for maximum characters and there needs to be some kind of length attached to it. So I'm going to say max length is equal to 100. And there we go. We have our class book with an ID of a UUID, our title, which is a minimal length of 1, our author, which is a string with a minimal length of 1 and a maximum length of 100. We have our description, which is completely optional, with a title describing what the book is, with also a max and minimal length. And then our rating, which needs to be between 0 and 100. Let's save this and open up our browser and refresh the page. If we scroll down now to our schema and we open up book, we can see that each thing's a little bit bigger than it used to be. So title now needs a minimal length of 1, and our rating needs an inclusive maximum of 101 and exclusive minimum of -1. And we scroll back up here now and we say try it out and we want to change rating to 102. And we click execute. We can see an error because this limit value is 101. However, if we change this to 101 and we click execute, this will also fail because the number needs to be less than 101. The message even describes ensure this value is less than 101. So let's come up here and say this is 100. And now if we say execute, we're going to get a successful 200 status code response because rating is within 0 to 100. Description is optional and it also has a minimal and maximum length. Our author minimal length is 1 and our maximal length is 100, so this fits perfectly. And then our title also sits within the minimal length of 1, and we're passing in a UUID. This wraps up this lecture on adding extra validation to each item within our book, and I will see you in the next video. In this lecture, we're going to be creating some book objects to go on our books list. I'm going to create a new function that's called create books. That's not asynchronous and not part of an API, but that is called when our get method is called if our list is less than 1. So let's go ahead and use this lecture to create these books. The first thing I'm going to do is scroll all the way to the bottom, and right under this create book, I'm going to create a new function called create books no API. So right under here, I'm going to create a new function. I'm going to add some interspaces so I have more room to type. And then right here, I'm going to say def create books no API with nothing as a parameter. And then right under here, I'm just going to create some books. So I'm going to say book 1 is equal to the book object or the book class. And inside here, I'm going to say ID equals, and we're going to need a UUID. So I'm going to hop into my browser, and I already have an online UUID generator tool, but just go to this URL and it's going to create an online UUID generator for us. And I'm just going to say copy that, go back to the code, and I'm just going to dump that in. And now I'm going to say title is equal to title 1. Author is equal to author 1. Description is equal to description 1. And I'm going to create a rating which is equal to 60. And now I'm just going to copy and paste and do this for all the other books, but I'm going to modify the UUID just a little bit so each ID is completely different with each book. In here, I'm going to speed up the video a little bit so we can create 4 books quickly, but feel free to slow the video down if you want to watch me copy and paste and create 4 books. And then we're just going to leave it at 4 books. And now I'm just going to say books.append book 1, book 2, book 3, and book 4. And now at the very top, I'm going to scroll all the way up till we get to our get, which is read all books. And right here, just for demonstration purposes, so we can do development a little bit quicker without creating books every single time, I'm going to create an if statement that if the length of books is less than 1, then to create the books, and then return the books regardless. So the first thing we're going to do is if length of books is less than 1, and if it is less than 1, then we're going to create the books no API. So if the books is at 0 elements, then we're going to create the 4 books at the bottom and then append it to books. If books is greater than or equal to 1 element, then we won't do the create books no API and we'll just return the books. So that means every time the server restarts during this development phase, that we will just keep our books. We'll always have 4 books while we're creating posts and puts and enhancements to the books. And therefore we don't have to create a book every single time we do any kind of development, because the server is always going to be reloading with new data. If we save this and our application is running, let's go back to our browser. I'm going to close this UUID generator tool and refresh the Swagger UI. If we hop over to our read all books, we can see there's no parameters, and I'm going to say try it out and execute. So with that, voila, we have 4 elements of books returned within our books list. If we add one to our books list and we say create a new book, and we get a success, and we jump back over to our read all books and we execute it, we're going to now have 5 books inside. So we have our description 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then the new book that we just created with our post method. However, if we restart our server, then all of the books are going to disappear. So that's when we do this if length of books is less than 1 to create all the books no API, just so we can add elements to the books. You could also accomplish this by adding the book objects directly to the list, but I wanted to hide it at the bottom of the file so we don't keep seeing it. This wraps up this lecture on how to add books to the book list to help us with our development purposes, and I will see you in the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to be changing the default example values that come pre-created anytime a request body is needed when we create a book. To do this in FastAPI, we're going to jump over to our code, and we need to create an inner class within class book. Right under rating, I'm going to create a new class called config. And under config, I'm going to create a dictionary called schema_extra. And now I'm going to create a dictionary where the key is an example and the value is an object of book. I'm going to start by saying example. And then inside example, I'm going to say ID is equal to a UUID. I'm going to scroll down to the end of my code just so I can grab a UUID from here. And I'm going to change this first number to a 1, just to make sure it's different from the other UUIDs. I'm going to create title, author, and description. Title is equal to Computer Science Pro. author is equal to coding with Roby, and the description is equal to a very nice description of a book. All right, now if I save my file with this inner class inside the book class, and I open up my browser, and I refresh the page, we can see that now the default values for the request body for creating a book has predetermined information that we created. We have an ID, which is equal to our UUID that we created, our title, which is Computer Science Pro, author, coding with Roby, and description, a very nice description of a book. If we click schema, we can now see at the bottom we have an example of an ordered map, also with our information that we fulfilled. And one thing I just noticed is that we are missing our rating within our request body for our book. So I'm going to go back to our code, and right under the description, I'm going to create rating, which is equal to 75. If we resave the application and head back to our browser, and we refresh our application, we can now see that rating, which is equal to 75, is now part of our request body, and it's now added to our schema. This wraps up this lecture on how to create predefined data within a request body for Swagger, and I will see you in the next video. In this lecture, we're going to be enhancing our Read All Books API so a client can now dictate how many books are returned when they call the specific API. We will be accomplishing this by creating a query parameter that a user can optionally pass in that's going to dictate to return all books or just a specific number of books. So let's dive in. The first thing I'm going to do here is within our Read All Books parameter, I'm going to create a query parameter. I'm going to make the variable books to return with an optional int that's going to be equal to none. And now I want to keep this if length books is less than 1 to create books no API. I want to keep that as the first thing that happens when this API is called. And now outside this if statement, I'm going to create a new if statement that's going to check to make sure books to return is true, so it has data, and that length of books is greater than or equal to the books to return. So I need to make sure if a user passes in like 7 books to return, but there's only 5 books, then we're just going to return all the books and not have to worry about books to return because they're asking for more books than we currently have in our books list. I also need to make sure books to return is greater than 0 because if a user types in like -1, we can't return -1 books. So we're going to prevent this from happening. So if a user types in -1 or -2, we're just going to return all the books as well. So the first thing we need to do is if books to return and length of books is greater than or equal to books to return, which is greater than 0. And here we want to create a new variable, I, which is equal to 1. We want to create a new list object, so new books, which is equal to an empty list. And now I'm going to say while I is less than or equal to books to return, new books.append books at the I specific index -1. And then we want to say I plus equals 1, and then after the entire while loop is complete, just to return the new books. All right, so let's think how this goes through. So when a user goes through our app.get, so our normal API call to retrieve all of the books, they may pass in a new integer at the end of the API. If a user does not pass in an integer, then this if statement is going to fail, which just returns all books at the end. So if a user doesn't type in anything, then we're just going to return all the books we currently have. If a user does pass in a variable, which is going to be an integer, then we want to make sure that books does have a value and that the length of books, so all of our books, is greater than or equal to the number the user is typing in. If not, we're just going to return all books. And lastly, we want to check to make sure books to return is greater than 0. If not, we're just going to return all books. We're then creating a variable I equals 1 and new books, which is equal to an empty list. And while I is less than books to return, we're just going to loop through all the books and add that element to the new books and return it. Let's save the file and try it out. So if I refresh our page and we say read all books, we now have an optional books to return query parameter we can pass in. If we just go ahead and execute without it, we'll see that we get all 4 books passed in. If we type in 1, we now get 1 book, author 1 and title 1. If we pass in 2, we now get 2 books returned as the response. If we pass in 3, we get 3. And lastly, if we pass in 4, we get all 4. And now let's check if we pass in 5. We still only get 4 with no error. And if we pass in -6, there should not be an error, but we will just return all the books that we currently have. This wraps up this lecture on how we've made a new query parameter that we can add to read all books, so a user can now dictate whether they get all of the books or a specific number of books. And I will see you in the next video. In this lecture, we're going to create a new API, which is a get by ID for the books. So we're going to say get this book by this ID and just return 1 book from it. So the first thing we need to do is create a new API call. I'm going to do this right under our first app.get. And we're going to have to start with using our app decorator. .get quotation marks, and then I'm going to make the path /book/book ID. And now that book ID needs to be in quotation marks. And now right under this app, we need to create a function. I'm going to call this function read book. So I'm going to type in async def read book. And then book ID is going to be of type UUID. And now I'm going to write a loop that loops through all the books until we find a book with that ID. So I'm going to say for x in books, if x.id is equal to book ID, then return x, which is going to be resembling the book with the ID that matches the book ID that was passed in through the API as a path parameter. All right, let's now save our file. And let's open up our browser and refresh. First, I'm going to say read all books. I'm only going to do this because this will call our books list to append all of these books. So try it out, execute, and now we got all these 4 books. I now need to snag one of these UUIDs. And now let's head down to our book/book ID, where we have a required path parameter of a UUID. If we don't pass anything in there, of course, Swagger is going to tell us that it's a required field and we're not allowed to call the API without it. So I'm going to paste in our UUID and now click execute. Immediately we can see that our GET request is going to call our URL import /book/the UUID, and as a response we're going to get the book that matches that UUID. This wraps up our GET request that has a specific ID attached so we can get a specific book based on the book ID, and I will see you in the next video. In today's lecture, we're going to be creating a put request method, which is going to allow us to update a book. We're going to be doing this by creating a new function called updateBook, passing in a UUID as a path parameter, and then as the request body, we're going to be passing in a book, which is going to enhance the book at the specific path parameter UUID location. So let's dive in. The first thing I'm going to do is under the app.post, I'm going to create a new API request called put, so @app.put. And as a URL path, I'm going to say book ID wrapped in brackets. And now under app.put, I'm going to create our function. So here I'm going to say async def update book. I'm going to pass in a book ID as the first parameter and then book as the second parameter. And now under update book, I'm going to create a new variable called counter, which is equal to 0. And now under counter, I'm going to have to loop through all the books and find the specific location where x.id is equal to the book ID. And then I need to find out exactly the location, which is going to be counter. So counter is going to keep track of each time we loop through books. And then I'm going to find the location of the books, update that book, and then return the book that we just updated. I'm going to be able to do this by typing in 4x in books, counter plus equal 1, if x.id is equal to book ID, then books at the location of counter minus 1 equals book, and then return books counter minus 1. Let's save the file, and I'm going to turn my server back on by saying unicorn books2 :app -- reload. And I'm going to open up my browser, refresh the screen. And here I'm going to start by saying read all books. And I'm going to do this just so we can execute the books to add and append 4 of the books. And here I'm going to update the first book with a rating of 60. So I'm going to grab the UUID located at 60. And now if we scroll all the way down to our put, which is /bookid, we have a book ID which is required at the UUID, and we also have an entire book as the request body. I'm going to say try it out, and at the location or the book ID path parameter, I'm going to pass in the UUID I just copied. I'm also going to copy the UUID and paste it into the request body. And here, I'm just going to change the description from a very nice description of a book to a great description of a book. And I'm going to keep the rating at 60. I'm now going to click execute. And we can see that we get a 200 status code with a new description of a very great book. If I scroll back up and I say execute the read all books again, we can see that the first book with a rating of 60, the description has changed to a very great description of a book. And nothing else has happened to our other books in the list. This is how we create a put request method using a request body of a book and being able to find the specific book by passing in the UUID as a path parameter. This wraps up this lecture, and I will see you in the next video. In this lecture, we're going to be creating a delete request method using the delete API. What we're going to do is create a new function called delete book that takes in a UUID as the path parameter within the delete functionality. So let's dive in. The first thing we're going to have to do is create an @app decorator with a .delete functionality, and I'm going to make the URL book ID in brackets. Under the request method, I'm going to create a new function called async def delete underscore book. And as the parameter, I'm going to pass in a book ID, which is of type UUID. And now the first thing we need to do is create a new variable, counter, which is equal to 0. And now we're going to have to loop through every book in books to find out where the book ID that we're passing in as the path parameter matches with the book ID of one of the books and book. We can do this by saying for x in books, counter plus equal 1. If x.id is equal to book ID, then we need to use the deletion, which is delete books at the location of counter -1. And then we're just going to return the ID back to the user so they know what book ID was deleted. All right, let's now open up our browser, our Swagger UI, refresh the screen, and we can see we get a new delete request method. I'm going to start by saying read all books so we can append all the books and grab a UUID. I'm going to grab this rating of 80. I'm going to copy the UUID, and now I'm going to go back down to delete, and I'm going to say try it out, and I'm going to pass in the UUID of the rating 80 book that we just saw. I'm going to execute, and we can see immediately we get a 200 status code return with an ID of this UUID deleted. If we now go back up to our get all and we execute this, we can see that the book that has the rating of 80 has been deleted from the list. Now again, if we restart our server, the rating of 80 book will come back into the list because we're not actually saving this information to a database of any kind. We will be doing that in an upcoming section. But as of right now, this wraps up the lecture on how to create a delete request method, and I will see you in the next video.